The wind came first, a low, moaning sound that rolled through the trees like something alive. We'd just finished dinner, sitting by the fire and letting the night settle in, when the first gust hit the tent hard enough to make the poles shudder. Then another, stronger one followed, and I remember the exact moment the sound changed, from wind to destruction. The fabric ripped with a noise that cut straight through me, and our tent folded like paper under a fist. By the time we scrambled over, the whole thing was gone. Poles snapped, rainfly tangled around a stump, our sleeping gear scattered into the darkness. Then the lightning started. It wasn't supposed to storm that night. We checked before we lost service, and the forecast looked clear for days, but out there, far from any road or cell signal, forecasts don't mean much. The first flash showed the ridgeline, jagged, black, and too close for comfort. The thunder hit a heartbeat later, deep enough to shake the ground beneath our boots. We grabbed what we could, huddled under a tarp near a boulder, and that's when I noticed Mark, sitting awkwardly, his leg bent wrong. At first, he tried to play it off, said it was just twisted, but when I saw the angle of his boot, the way his face had gone pale and tight, I knew better. The wind screamed around us, throwing grit into our eyes, and I heard myself say, "We need to hit the beacon." Our personal locator beacon sat in the top of my pack, packed for emergencies only, the kind of thing you bring hoping you'll never need. But the decision didn't take long. I pulled it out, flipped the protective cover and pressed the button. A tiny light blinked red, steady and mechanical, completely indifferent to our situation. That was it. Our whole fate reduced to a blinking dot in the wilderness. "Signal sent," I said, trying to sound calm, but inside I was anything but. I'd used satellite messengers before, but never like this. Never with a broken leg, never while lightning cracked over our heads. The storm grew worse, rain slicing sideways, the tarp flapping like a trapped bird. We lashed it down with paracord and crouched close together, our backs against the cold granite, the world closing in around us. Time changed its meaning after that. Every minute stretched, drawn tight with waiting. We didn't know if anyone had received the signal, or if the storm was blocking it. I kept checking the beacon's light, half expecting it to die out to betray us silently. Mark's breathing grew uneven. Pain will do that even when you're trying not to show it. I tried to keep him talking, asking about his family, his favourite camping spots, anything to fill the space between thunderclaps. I can still hear that wind when I close my eyes. It wasn't just sound, it was pressure, movement, life. And in that roaring, it felt like we'd fallen off the map completely. We were just two figures clinging to a slab of stone while the storm ate the world, trusting that somewhere beyond it, someone might be watching a little blinking light and making their way toward us. The storm didn't stop, it just changed its rhythm. The thunder softened into a distant growl, and the rain came steady, like 1,000 tiny hands drumming on the tarp. The lightning moved farther down the ridge, but the wind still tore through the valley in bursts. It was past midnight, though I'd lost track of the hours. My watch had fogged over and every breath steamed in the air. The fire was long dead. We were soaked, cold, and waiting on faith alone. Mark was shivering hard now. I'd splinted his leg as best I could using 2 broken tent poles and a sleeve from my pack, tied off with strips of paracord. His pain was under control, only because he'd passed that edge where the body goes numb for a while. He tried to joke a few times, something about first and last modelling gig for outdoor gear gone wrong, but his voice trembled. Between us, the beacon blinked on the wet rock, tiny and defiant against the blackness. That light became our world. Each flash was a heartbeat, a promise that maybe someone was coming. "Think they got it?" he asked, after what felt like the 100th blink. "I think so," I said, though I didn't know. "They'll launch as soon as they can fly." He nodded, staring at the tarp's edge where rain pooled and spilled over. I just wish I could hear it. A helicopter, a truck, something. So did I. The silence between gusts was crushing, the kind that makes you aware of every small sound your own body makes. My stomach growled. I could hear water dripping down my collar, the hiss of wind shifting through pine needles, Mark's uneven breaths, everything else. The world beyond that, felt unreachable. Hours stretched thin. At some point, I began to doubt the beacon entirely. What if the antenna broke? What if we'd pressed it wrong? What if no one even knew where to look? That thought crept in quietly, then grew until it filled all the space the storm had left. It's strange how fast confidence can erode out there, how quickly your mind turns on you when all you can do is wait. I tried to keep busy, checked the splint, cleared runoff channels for the top, boiled a little water with the last of our stove fuel, anything to stay moving. When I stopped, the stillness pressed back like weight. The beacon kept blinking. I began to hate that light. Every flash reminded me that we were powerless, that our survival now depended on something invisible, silent, and utterly out of our control. Around what I guessed was dawn, the rain thinned to mist. The sky above us glowed faintly grey. For a brief moment, I thought I heard something. A low thumping carried through the air. I stood, heart hammering, scanning the ridgeline, but it was only the wind changing direction again, funneling through the canyon. Mark stirred. Was that them? Not yet, I said quietly. I forced a smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. They'll come. And though I said it out loud, I wasn't sure anymore who I was trying to convince, him or myself. When daylight finally broke, it came slow and pale, like the sun was hesitating to see what the storm had done. Mist hung between the trees, thick as smoke, and everything we owned dripped water. My fingers were stiff, raw from the cold, but I forced myself up and took stock. The tent was shredded beyond repair. Half our gear was gone, blown downslope during the night. But the beacon still blinked, that stubborn red light cutting through the morning fog. Mark stirred beneath the top. His face was grey, lips pale. I gave him the last of our water and a bite of what used to be a protein bar before it soaked through. He smiled weakly, said something about how this wasn't the relaxing weekend he'd promised his wife. I laughed, because the alternative was breaking down completely. By then, my mind had moved beyond fear. It was something colder, an emptiness that came from knowing you'd done all you could. We pressed the button, rigged shelter, rationed what little food we had. Now all that was left was waiting. The signal would either bring help, or it wouldn't. There was nothing else to do but exist in that narrow space between hope and resignation. I busied myself anyway, collected runoff from a tarp corner, arranged kindling in case the sun warmed things enough to dry. When you're stuck like that, doing something keeps your sanity intact. I even caught myself talking to the beacon, absurd as it was. You're working, right? You're doing your job? I said it quietly, like a prayer to a machine. The forest was unnervingly still after the night's violence. No birds yet, no movement, just that soft hiss of wet air and the occasional crack of a branch dropping its burden of rain. Every sound made me look up, heart racing, hoping it was a rotor or an engine, something human. But each time, it was only wind or water. By late morning, the clouds began to lift. Through the thinning mist, the mountains looked carved from steel, cold and sharp-edged. I climbed a few yards up a rise to get a better view, though I didn't dare leave Mark for long. From up there, I could see the scar the storm had carved through the valley. Trees downed, the stream swollen and angry. Somewhere beyond that, civilization waited, impossibly far away. Back at camp, Mark had gone quiet again. His breathing was shallow. I checked his pulse, steady but weak. His leg looked bad, the swelling had increased, and I worried about shock. I gave him my jacket, tucked it around his shoulders and told him we'd hear something soon. And then, faint and far off, I heard it. A low, rhythmic pulse that didn't belong to the forest. It took a few seconds for my mind to register it, and when it did, I froze. It wasn't wind. This time, it wasn't thunder. It was the thump of rotor blades. I looked up through the mist and saw a grey shape sliding between the clouds. "They're coming," I said, though the words barely came out. My throat was tight, my eyes burning. For the first time in nearly 12 hours, the blinking beacon didn't look so small. At first, I didn't believe it. The sound was faint, uneven, bouncing through the canyons in a way that made distance impossible to judge. But then the echo sharpened. A steady, mechanical thumping that couldn't be anything but a helicopter. I scrambled onto the highest rock near camp, waving my arms like a madman, shouting until my voice cracked. The mist was still thick enough to blur the ridgeline, but a dark outline passed overhead, maybe 100 feet above the treetops. Then it vanished into cloud again. I bolted back to Mark. "They're here!" I said, shaking his shoulder gently. His eyes flickered open, dazed. I pressed the beacon into my palm again, praying the crew had our coordinates locked in. "Just hang in there. They'll find us." But the minutes dragged on. The sound came and went, sometimes close, sometimes distant. The clouds moved fast, breaking and reforming as if deliberately hiding us. I waved a bright orange tarp, burned the last of our stove fuel trying to get a smoky signal going. Still, the chopper didn't appear again. And that's when the doubt crept back, fierce and cold. What if they'd passed right over us? What if the storm had scrambled the signal, or they'd marked the wrong ridge? I imagined them circling somewhere miles away while we sat invisible in the mist. My stomach clenched. That feeling, the helplessness. It's something I wouldn't wish on anyone. You realise how small you are out there, how much your fate depends on luck and weather and batteries. Mark tried to speak, but winced. "You'll wave them down," he said quietly, eyes closing again. "You always find a way." I gripped his shoulder and nodded, though inside, panic was clawing at me. Then, through a break in the clouds, a single shaft of sunlight pierced the fog. It lit the granite beside us, glinting off the beacon's wet casing. The helicopter returned, this time low, close enough that I could see the insignia on the side. The downdraft whipped the tarp into my face, and I nearly lost my footing, but I didn't stop waving. The pilot must have seen it. The machine tilted, banking toward our position. A voice crackled faintly through the air, too faint to make out. Then the chopper hovered just downslope, rotors scattering rain in sheets. I could see a figure leaning out the open door, gesturing. Relief hit me so fast, I almost collapsed. They couldn't land on our spot. The trees were too dense, but I saw a rope line drop, swinging in the wind. 2 rescuers came down, helmets gleaming wet. The noise was deafening. I shouted, pointing toward Mark. They nodded, moving fast, calm, practiced. When they reached him, everything became strangely quiet in my head, though the helicopter still roared above. I just stood there, rain dripping from my hair, watching as they wrapped his leg, checked his vitals, secured him to the stretcher. One rescuer gave me a thumbs up. That simple gesture broke something inside me. My knees gave out, and for the first time since the storm began, I let myself breathe. They lifted Mark first. I watched the stretcher sway in the rotor wash, rising through the fog until he disappeared into the grey belly of the helicopter. Then, one of the rescuers turned to me and tapped his headset, shouting something I couldn't hear. He pointed upward, then at me. I shook my head. There wasn't room for 2 in the lift. He frowned, made a cutting motion across his throat, then gave a thumbs up. They'd come back. And just like that, the line jerked up and vanished. And I was alone again in the dripping silence. The chopper's sound faded over the ridge, leaving only the hiss of wind through wet leaves. I sank to the ground, back against the boulder, and finally let the exhaustion hit. Every muscle in my body throbbed. My hands trembled from cold and adrenaline. The forest, for the first time since the night before, felt still. Too still. The mist thinned enough that I could see patches of sky, pale and clean, as though the storm had scrubbed the world raw. It took nearly an hour before I heard the rotors again. I used the time to pack what was left. The beacon, my knife, a few scraps of gear that hadn't been shredded. I even found one of Mark's gloves tangled in a bush and tucked it into my pocket. When the helicopter returned, I stood ready, but this time there was no panic. I knew help was coming. The rescue tech came down on the line like an apparition out of the clouds. He grinned behind his visor, yelled something about tough night, and I laughed. A broken, half-crazed laugh that felt more like relief than humour. He clipped me in, signalled upward, and the ground began to fall away. From above, the valley looked peaceful. You'd never guess how close we'd come to breaking. The stream glinted silver in the returning light, the storm's damage softened by distance. I could see the shredded scraps of our camp, tiny, insignificant. And beyond that, miles of untouched wilderness stretching toward the horizon. In the helicopter, Mark was pale but awake, hooked to oxygen and looking a little better. He gave me a weak thumbs up. I returned it, too tired for words. One of the rescuers handed me a blanket and a thermos. "You boys picked one hell of a spot," he said with a grin. I nodded, managing a smile. As we banked toward the distant base, I stared out at the vast, silent land below. That blinking red light, the one I'd cursed, prayed to and doubted, had saved us. But it also reminded me how fragile that line between safety and disaster really is. Out there, all it takes is one storm, one mistake, one twist of fate to strip away the illusion of control. Even now, when I hear wind rising through the trees, I think of that night, of the humbling silence that comes when you realise you're no longer the one steering the story. Sometimes the best you can do is send your signal, hold on, and trust that someone, somewhere, is listening.